A cowboy said, "We'll learn love together if you'll stay," to a native girl after she said, "I ain't good at love." The last snow hadn't yet surrendered the ridgelines of the Bitterroots. Even in April, white still clung to the north-facing slopes like sorrow that wouldn't melt. Wind pressed low along Lolo Creek, pushing through the pines with the scent of damp bark, spent ash, and something older, something unsettled. It had been almost a year since the Nez Perce moved through this valley, chased eastward towards surrender and silence. Their trails had long since vanished beneath frost and pine needles, but the land hadn't forgotten. Nothing in these woods ever truly vanished. It only waited. Caleb Rourke was tracking a lost calf that morning, weaving his way through timber just west of his ranch. The sun had barely cleared the trees when his mare snorted and stopped, hoofs planted firm. Caleb leaned forward, squinting into the underbrush. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an elk. It was a woman. She sat slumped against the base of an old pine, coat torn at the shoulder, boots half unlaced and caked in mud. Her braid had come undone, hair tangled with needles and snowmelt. Her face was hollow, lips chapped raw, eyes flat with distance, like something wild that had just stopped running. Caleb dismounted slow, reins still in hand. "You hurt?" She didn't answer at first. Her gaze drifted toward him, unsure, unfocused. Then, barely audible, "No." A pause. "But I need help." He nodded once. "You've got it." She didn't cry, didn't flinch or lean into him. She just looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then took it with fingers scraped and cold and let him guide her toward the horse. "My name's Caleb Rourke," he said as he helped her into the saddle. She swallowed. "Tala," she said. "Tala Whitstar." He didn't ask anything more, not out here, not beneath trees that had seen too much. Caleb didn't speak again as they rode. He kept the mare steady, letting her pick her way through the damp ground and half-melted snowdrifts. Tala didn't say much either. She sat behind him, her weight light and rigid, her hands gripping the saddle horn instead of him. She didn't lean close for warmth, didn't shiver, though he could feel the cold in her through the leather. When they reached the cabin, he helped her down but didn't guide her. Just opened the door and let her step inside first. She paused in the threshold, like she wasn't sure if she belonged there. He didn't rush her. The fire was low, but still alive. He stoked it while she stood near the door, one hand braced against the wall, like her legs might forget how to stand. He poured her coffee, black and strong, and handed her a cup without a word. She took it, held it, but didn't drink. Her fingers trembled just slightly around the tin. Her voice came quiet after a while. "You live alone?" He nodded. "Closest neighbor's 4 miles west. That's a preacher and his wife. Rest's just trees and wind." She stared into the fire. Good. That one word carried too much weight for a simple answer. Caleb didn't press. Instead, he offered her a dry blanket, one of his spare shirts, and pointed her toward the back room. She disappeared behind the curtain, slow and silent. That night, he heard her pacing. The old floor creaked with each soft footstep, back and forth, over and over. It wasn't the sound of someone restless. It was the sound of someone afraid to lie down, someone who'd learned that rest could be dangerous. In the morning, she was already outside when he stepped onto the porch. She stood by the fence, coat wrapped around her too tight, hair pulled back in a rough knot, watching the sun lift over the hills like she didn't quite trust it to rise. He didn't say anything, just watched her for a moment. This woman who had dropped into his woods like a ghost, a scar still walking. She didn't ask to stay, and Caleb didn't ask if she planned to leave. That first day, she barely spoke. She moved through the cabin like a shadow, silent, watchful, her hands brushing against walls like she was trying to memorize the shape of safety. When he offered her bread and stew, she nodded her thanks, but ate with the cautious rhythm of someone who'd gone too long without trusting what was warm. At night, she didn't sleep in the bed. She curled instead in the far corner of the guest room, back against the wall, knees drawn in tight beneath the blanket he'd given her. Caleb heard her shift once, twice, but never lie still. Not until dawn began to edge the windows with gray. He didn't ask questions, not about where she'd come from or what had sent her through the snow with blood on her knuckles and mud on her boots. He only set out a second tin cup in the morning, warmed 2 slices of cornmeal, and left the door open when he went out to check the fences. When he came back, she was sitting near the hearth again, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The fire had burned low, but she'd added a log herself, careful not to smother the coals. That was the first moment he knew she intended to survive. "You need anything?" he asked. She looked up, blinked once, then shook her head. Her voice was hoarse. "No, just quiet." "You've got that, too." He didn't hover. He didn't ask who'd hurt her. He didn't offer empty comfort. He simply moved about his day, steady and quiet, splitting wood, checking tack, boiling water for tea when the wind turned sharp again. That evening, she stood on the porch beside him for a while, their shoulders not quite touching. She didn't look at him, but she didn't flinch when he offered her a mug, steam rising between their fingers. "Was it always this quiet out here?" she asked. He nodded. "Mostly." "That's good." She didn't need more than that. And he didn't need more from her. Sometimes kindness isn't loud. Sometimes it's a fire left burning just long enough for someone else to find their way back to it. But sometimes one quiet moment in the snow can change everything. What happened after Tala stepped into Caleb's life? Keep reading. Her silence held more than sorrow. The stew simmered low, thick with venison and wild onion. Tala sat near the hearth, her knees drawn up beneath Caleb's patched wool blanket. She didn't speak, but her hands moved, a small, steady rhythm as she peeled the last of the potatoes he'd left on the table. Caleb stirred the pot, watching her from the corner of his eye. He didn't interrupt her silence. The fire had begun to settle into coals, casting a warm orange glow across the cabin walls. Outside, snow had finally begun to give way to mud and the first stubborn shoots of spring. It was the 3rd evening she had stayed, and the first time she spoke of anything before this place. "I lived near Salmon," she said, voice low like a confession not meant for echo, "not far from the mining town." Caleb didn't move. "My husband worked underground. Not steady work, but enough. Then, one spring, there was a collapse." Her voice didn't crack. If anything, it got calmer. "He died quick. That's what they told me." A long pause. She set the knife down beside her, wiped her hands on her skirt, even though there was nothing left on them. "A man came through the town not long after, said he'd lost his own in the war, said he could help." She looked at the fire, not at Caleb. "He said all the right things. And then, one night, he hit me." Stillness thickened. The cabin didn't creak. The fire didn't pop. Even the stew seemed to hold its breath. "I thought maybe it was just once, something I did. But it wasn't. It kept coming. And then one day, I knew I had to run." She didn't mention the children yet, didn't explain the bruise fading down the side of her jaw. She just looked at the flames and said, "I walked 5 days through the cold. Didn't plan to end up here, but my legs stopped walking when they saw your smoke." Caleb reached for the poker, shifted the log. The fire flared gently, licking orange up the brick. "I'm not asking for anything," she added. "Just quiet. Just a place to breathe." "You have it," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She didn't thank him. He didn't need her to. Some truths, once spoken aloud, don't ask for forgiveness or reply. They just sit between two people like the first shape of something neither of them knows how to name yet. Tala didn't ask what time breakfast was, and Caleb didn't tell her. Each morning, he left a portion of oats by the stove before riding out to check the fence lines. Sometimes she ate it, sometimes she didn't. The tin bowl was always rinsed and placed back on the shelf by the time he returned. That was enough. She moved like someone used to going unnoticed, not sneaking, just careful, quiet. She mended the tear in one of his saddle blankets without comment, left it folded on the porch rail. When he found it, all he said was a soft, "Well," before laying it across the mare's back. On the fourth morning, Caleb came back from the creek to find the woodpile restacked. Not just added to, organized. Small kindling, then split logs, then the wide ones for overnight burn. She hadn't made a sound doing it. She never offered to help, never waited for permission. But slowly, her touch began to live in the corners of the cabin. A patched curtain here. Herbs hung to dry above the window. A fresh tin of lard on the shelf where he hadn't realized they were running low. It wasn't homemaking, it was survival, done efficiently, without fuss, as if she expected to be gone again by first thaw. One evening, while he was oiling the hinges on the barn door, she walked past him, empty feed bucket in hand. "You don't have to do that," he said, not unkindly. She paused. Her answer came without hesitation. "I know." And then she kept walking. That night they shared stew again. She refilled his bowl without asking, and he didn't stop her. She sat across the table, her eyes tired but not guarded. "I don't believe in love," she said, as if they were mid-conversation. Caleb didn't look up. He took another bite, swallowed. "Neither do I," he replied, "but I do believe in trying again." She studied him for a long moment. Her face didn't change, but she didn't argue either. Outside, wind stirred the trees. Inside, the fire held steady, and for the first time, so did something else, something unspoken, sitting quiet between them, not fragile, but still small. They weren't lovers, they weren't even friends, not yet, but they were no longer strangers. The dawn was pale, stretched thin across the sky like gauze. Mist still clung to the low brush near the barn when Caleb stepped out, coffee in hand. He stopped short. Tala was already there, sitting cross-legged near the corral fence, her back straight, hands resting on her knees. Her face was turned east, toward the rising sun, eyes open but unfocused, like she wasn't watching the morning but listening to it. He didn't speak. He just stood, sipping from his tin mug, letting the silence swell between them. It wasn't awkward, it was full. After a while she said, "The land sings if you know how to hear it." Caleb nodded, not because he fully understood, but because he knew better than to answer with words that weren't needed. "My grandfather taught me that," she went on, barely louder than the wind. "He was Salish, said the ground has memory, not just of blood, but of kindness too." She looked down at her palms, calloused and scarred. "I forgot how to listen, for a long time." Caleb walked over, slow and unhurried, and sat beside her in the grass. The steam from his mug curled up toward the sky, then vanished. "You remembered," he said simply. She glanced at him, not smiling, but softened. "I heard the creek yesterday," she said. "Not just the water, the rocks beneath it, the hush of moss. First time I noticed in months." They sat there, side by side, as light grew thicker on the ridge. Behind them, the chickens stirred. A horse nickered low in the barn. The world began again, as it always did. "I put a flower in your Bible," she said suddenly, her voice as neutral as breath. "Not for God, for gratitude." Caleb's brow twitched. "Which page?" She didn't answer. "That's fair," he said, setting his mug down. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden token, an old worn horseshoe, carved from pine, looped with a string. He placed it on the ground between them. "My brother made it," he said, "before he left for the war. I found it again this winter." Tala looked at the carving, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're not offering it?" "No," Caleb replied, "just showing you I still carry it." Tala picked up the token, turned it once in her hand, then set it back gently where it had been. The sun rose higher, casting golden light on frost-touched grass. They said no more that morning, but something shifted, subtle, true. A silent tether drawn between two people, still unsure of what they wanted, but certain now of where to start looking. Together. It was late afternoon when Tala returned from the woods behind the ridge, a small bundle of white bark and green leaves tucked into her sash. Caleb spotted her from the shed, where he'd been sorting nails and old hinges. She knelt near the porch steps, unwinding the cloth carefully, her fingers moving with the ease of memory. Aspen bark, willow, a sprig of wild mint. He approached slowly. "For the horses?" he asked, eyeing the herbs. "For healing," she said, "for remembering what softens pain." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask more. Instead, he sat nearby, elbows on knees, watching as she crushed the bark gently with a stone and packed it into a small glass jar. "A man named Tennant taught me this," she murmured, voice low. "Lives near Mission Valley, half Salish, half French. He taught my mother, then me." She paused, rubbing the mint between her fingers. "He said the earth does not choose us, but it watches how we walk, and it remembers kindness." She met Caleb's eyes. "I think that's what your ranch does. It remembers you." Caleb blinked once, surprised. "I've never thought of land that way." Tala gave a slight shrug. "That's because it hasn't had to forgive you." She said it without cruelty, just observation. But it landed with a strange warmth in Caleb's chest, like a truth he didn't know he'd needed to hear. Inside the cabin, the fire popped gently. Tala stood and moved toward the door, but paused before entering. "There's a page in your Bible," she said over her shoulder. "It has a pressed bluebell. That's where I left it." He didn't respond, just nodded. That night, after chores and supper, when Tala and the children had settled near the fire, Caleb fetched the worn book from the shelf above his bed. He thumbed through carefully, and there it was, a bluebell, brittle and pale, folded between psalms. It wasn't a passage about vengeance or strength. It was Psalm 46. "Be still and know that I am God." He stared at the page for a long time. Later, when he sat beside Tala on the porch, he didn't mention the flower. Instead, he said, "I reckon some things don't need prayers out loud to count as worship." Tala didn't smile, but she reached over and laid her hand on his knee. Her touch was light, steady. "My people used to sing without words," she said, "just the sound of breath meeting sky." She looked up at the darkening clouds. Maybe that's enough for him, too. Caleb exhaled slowly. "It is for me." The wind shifted gently across the fields. In the distance, a hawk wheeled above the ridge. Between them, the quiet deepened. Not empty, but sacred. The ride to Elk Bend took them 2 days. They didn't speak much on the trail. Just the rhythm of hooves, the breath of horses, the occasional creek crossed with a splash. Tala kept her eyes forward, but Caleb could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the reins too tightly. She hadn't seen her children in almost 5 months. They reached the small mission on the edge of Elk Bend as the sun began to drop behind the cottonwoods. The place looked humble. Whitewashed walls, a bell that hadn't rung in weeks, smoke rising from a narrow chimney. A woman came to the door. Gray hair tucked into a braid, her apron dusted with flour. She studied Caleb, then Tala, and finally nodded. "They're out back," she said simply. "They never forgot." Tala dismounted before the words were finished. She didn't run. She walked with the dignity of someone afraid her legs might give out if she moved too fast. Caleb followed at a distance. Behind the house, in a patch of yard edged by low willow, two small figures sat on a blanket, drawing shapes in the dirt with sticks. The girl looked up first. Wayana. Her hair had grown long, tied with a blue ribbon that looked too clean, too proper for a child used to running wild. She blinked, once, twice. Then she screamed, "Mama!" Tala fell to her knees before the child reached her. Wayana crashed into her mother's arms, sobbing without sound. Zoe came slower, more cautious, but when Tala opened one arm to him, he melted into her side like a lost piece returning to its place. Caleb stood under the branches and watched, heart caught tight in his throat. He had seen grief. He had seen loss that broke men. But he had never seen anything as holy as this kind of reunion. Tala rocked both children, her eyes shut, face buried in their hair. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. A prayer, perhaps, or just a thank you. That night, the widow offered them the back room, one mattress, one wool blanket, and a basin of warm water. Tala curled around her children, her fingers tangled in Wayana's braid. Zoe's tiny hand pressed to her chest. Caleb sat by the hearth, keeping watch as shadows shifted on the floor. Tala looked over once. Their eyes met. She mouthed one word, "Thank you." He nodded once, just enough. Morning on the trail back. They left at first light, the children bundled in blankets, sleepy and quiet. Wayana rode with her mother, arms around Tala's waist. Zoe sat before Caleb, eyes wide with the kind of curiosity only small boys possess. Every so often, he'd glance up at Caleb, then quickly away. 2 hours into the ride, the boy finally asked, "Are you a cowboy?" Caleb chuckled, "Guess I am." "Do you shoot bad men?" "Only the ones that need it." Zoe was silent for a beat, then, "You shot the one that hurt Mama?" Caleb shook his head. "No, but I helped her run far enough that he won't ever find her." The boy thought that over, then quietly, "That's good." Up ahead, Tala didn't turn around, but Caleb saw her shoulders ease just slightly. The snow was still clinging to the north gullies, had carried too long in silence, had finally been shared. The snow was still clinging to the north gullies when they returned to the ranch, but something had softened. Caleb saw it first in the way Wayana stepped off the horse, one hand still clinging to Tala's, but her eyes scanning the place like she might belong to it someday. Zoe ran straight to the fence line where the chickens clucked. "Do they bite?" he asked. "Only if you insult 'em," Caleb said, deadpan. The boy looked back, uncertain if it was a joke. Tala smiled for the first time in front of Caleb. That evening they ate by firelight, stew thick with dried venison, carrots, and the last of last year's onions. Wayana helped serve. Zoe chewed loudly. Caleb didn't mind. After dinner, he found a box of charcoal and scraps of brown paper. The children sat on the floor, drawing horses with wings. Tala stitched by lamplight. The house wasn't quiet anymore, but it wasn't loud either. It breathed, like something alive. In the days after, Tala moved through the house with more purpose now. She swept without being asked, patched a rip in Wayana's dress, started kneading dough in the morning with flour she rationed like a woman who had known true hunger. Wayana fed the hens every dawn, boots too big for her feet but tied tight with twine. Zoe followed Caleb into the pasture most days, carrying a stick like a rifle and asking questions only half out loud. "Is that where the coyotes come? Why does the sky look closer here? Were you alone before we came?" Caleb didn't always answer, but he always listened. One evening, after they drove in the cattle, Caleb found Tala brushing out the old draft gelding's winter coat. The barn smelled of straw and warm animal sweat. "You ever think about building a second room?" she asked, not looking up. Caleb leaned against the stall. "That your way of saying I snore?" "No," she smiled faintly. "Just thinking, Wayana and Zoe might need their own space come summer." He tilted his head. "You plan to stay that long?" She paused, the brush stilled in her hand. "I'm thinking on it." Caleb stepped closer, picked up a brush. "We could tear down the back wall, add 2 rooms easy." "I've got lumber." "You'd do all that." He met her gaze. "You and the young ones need more room. That's reason enough." Tala said nothing more that night, but her hand, when she passed him the brush, lingered just a breath longer. Later that week, Tala stood on the porch while Wayana picked blackberries and Zoe chased the goat. She held a basket of mending at her feet, needle moving steady through worn seams. The wind carried the sound of the children's laughter across the field. Caleb paused mid-hammer, one boot braced on a beam, and watched her. That night, after the kids had gone to sleep, Tala joined him on the porch. No shawl, just the chill and the stars. "I used to think roots were dangerous," she said softly. Caleb didn't speak. "That staying meant giving someone a place to strike, to break you where you stood." Still no reply. "But this land, it listens. It doesn't press." Caleb reached over, took her hand gently. "You don't have to stay," he said, "but I'll be here as long as you do." Tala looked down at their joined hands. "I don't want to guess anymore," she said. "If I put down roots here, you'd best be sure." "I am," Caleb said. "I was the day you let me help." She didn't answer in words. She didn't need to. She stayed on the porch until the cold crept in her bones. Then she leaned into him, not bold, not desperate, just quiet, and didn't pull away. It was the first real rain of the season, fat drops drumming soft against the tin roof, the scent of sage and freshly turned earth thick in the air. Tala stepped out from the barn, pail of feed in one hand, skirt damp and clinging to her legs. Caleb joined her midway, brushing past the rain without a word. Together they crossed the last stretch to the porch, wet but unspoken in step. Inside, Wayana and Zoe drew horses with wings from bits of charcoal. The fire burned low, steady and unshaken by the storm. Caleb handed Tala a dry towel. She took it, paused, and looked at him instead of drying her hair. "Well," she said quietly, voice rough with astonishment, "that's the most excitement we've had all week." He didn't tease, just met her gaze, steady as a mountain. "You sayin' I'm not exciting?" Her lips twitched, half a smirk. "I'm saying you're steady." "Steady's better," he said. They stood there, the rain soft on the roof, as the children fell asleep behind the new partition in the room Tala had helped build. Tala slipped from bed and walked to the window, watching dusk and rain fold into one another. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. "I had a dream last week," she said, breaking the silence. Caleb looked up from packing his pipe. "What kind?" "I was walking by a river with Wayana and Zoe. They held baskets of apples, but I didn't have to look over my shoulder." He paused, finger steady on the tobacco. "Took me a while to remember it," she added. "I never remember dreams." Caleb didn't speak until he was near enough to brush her cheek gently. "You think that's where you want to go?" She shook her head, eyes soft. "I think it's what I needed to let go of." Tiny droplets traced her lashes and chin, like rain inside, not out. "I reckon you want to plant apples." Tala startled, voice lifted in surprise. "You think I can grow an orchard?" He smiled faintly, tucking pipe away. "Not in 1 year, but maybe 1 tree to start." Her laughter was low and startled and full with something that tasted like relief. "Seems a good way to begin," she whispered. By dawn, the storm had passed. The world glowed new, Fields dark with rain, rooftops frosted in green sprout. Birds called out shakily for their mates. They ate breakfast quietly. Tala poured coffee and passed bowls of oats with a calmness that felt earned. Caleb cleared the table and paused by Tala. "You planning to stay through summer?" he asked softly. She paused with spoon midair, then nodded. He folded his arms. "We could prune existing apple trees, take grafts. I know a man in the Zula who'll ship rootstock." Tala's eyes filled, not with tears, but with shine. "You'd do that?" He met her eyes steady. "For you and them? Easy reason enough." She turned her face slightly toward the light, hair damp and glowing. Outside, Wayana dug at soft ground near the porch. She was planting something small, the first garden seed from last summer's pickling crop. Sawi came with his carved stick horse and pressed it upright like a banner on the hill. Caleb offered Tala his arm, and she accepted, her fingers sliding soft and certain into his. They stood together in that rain-softened morning, two people bound by floods, roots, and slow things growing under the soil. The orchard, the children, the house expansion, they were all part of one life taking shape. But the real promise lay in knowing that the world could still yield sweetness even after bitter seasons had come and passed. If this story has touched something in you, the way trust is built without words, give it a like and subscribe. There's more ahead, and it only gets more beautiful. Early June came on gentle feet. The frost had long gone, and the northern gullies of the ranch were already green with new grass. Bees hummed lazily among the lavender along the porch, and the air smelled of seed and promise. Tala stood just outside the back door, her hands resting on the weathered latch. She watched as Wayana coaxed hens from the coop, and Sawi chased after a particularly bold goat. The children's laughter spilled across the yard like sunlight. She folded the latch closed and looked at Caleb, who was shin-deep in the soft soil, adjusting fence posts not far off. No words passed between them for a moment. Finally, Tala spoke, quiet, deliberate. "If I stay through the summer, the children should have their own room, a space just for them." She turned, letting her voice ride the breeze. Caleb didn't hesitate. He stood and wiped his hands on his canvas trousers. "What do you need?" Tala didn't ask for more than he'd already offered. He'd always offered without asking. "The back wall. Take it down. Build them 2 beds, a place for music or drawing, nothing big, but enough." He nodded. "I've got lumber in the shed," he said. "May take me a week to pull it out." She stared across the field at him, not with caution, but something steadier. "You'd do that?" He rested a hand on his horse's flank and met her eyes. "For you and them, that's reason enough." A warmth crossed her face, a faint smile, so soft she might have thought no one would see. In the next hour, Caleb was in the shed, hauling planks and nails out to the porch. He set them in neat piles, tall boards, studs, roof beams, without announcing his intent. When Tala passed by on her way to gather eggs, she glanced at the wood with surprise. He simply tipped his hat and went back to carrying. Later, he found Tala in the kitchen. She had fetched water to soak the broad timbers. "I should help," she started. Caleb shook his head. "This is your decision, Tala." Their eyes met over the rim of the bucket. No more defenses. Just the clear water, trembling between them. And in that quiet, she nodded. He wrapped her fingers with his calloused hand. "You're good at staying," he said softly. "That's enough for me." She squeezed once, and that small squeeze felt like the beginning of something large. Twilight settled early in late June. The air cooled around the garden. Tendrils of jasmine curled against the porch posts, and lavender petals drifted into the dusk. Tala sat on the steps, legs wrapped beneath her, watching Wayana thread blackberries onto twine, and Soe chase a cricket across the grass. Caleb approached from the barn, wiping sweat and wood dust from his brow. He stopped a few feet away and said nothing. She looked up, tired but steady. "I still freeze when kindness comes my way," she said after a while. The words were soft but full, like a confession she'd rehearsed in whispers. Caleb stepped closer and lowered himself beside her. "Tell me why you run," he said gently. She drew a breath, but held it. "I get colder when warmth is offered too early. I learn to push away rather than let someone in. I don't trust when someone is too kind." He didn't interrupt. He simply reached and took both her hands in his rough ones. "You're good at staying," he repeated. "That's enough for me." She swallowed hard. "I didn't know that staying meant more than just not leaving." A breeze carried stray blossoms across the dirt. He shifted slightly to face her fully. "I didn't promise perfection," he said softly. "I promised presence. I'm not offering charades, just being here." An awkward silence followed, the kind loaded with more meaning than words. She blinked once, then looked at him fully for the first time. "And what if I fail? Again?" Caleb's voice was calm. "Then we try again. Together." She let her hands rest in his. They stayed on the porch until the stars felt close enough to touch, until the cicada slowed and the barn's door swung shut with distant creak. Inside, he lit 2 tin lamps, one for the kitchen table, one for the children's corner. Tala moved slowly, stepping around Wayana's bedtime drawings and Sowi's stacked blocks. She stopped by the table and turned toward him. Would you marry someone with this history?" Caleb's eyebrows rose, and for a moment the world hung still. "Are you asking?" Her nod was barely visible. "I want you to be honest." Caleb knelt down beside the table. "I've seen scars. I've traced bonds broken by war. I've watched the way a woman can stand after the world tries to break her. Tala, if you asked me, I'd have said yes long ago." Tala swallowed. Her eyes shimmered. "Do you mean it?" He reached up and gently tucked a stray curl from her braid behind her ear. "I meant it the day you took that pollen-filled taupe shaft from my horse's mane and let it settle on your clothes." Tala blinked, confused for a moment, and then realized he spoke of a moment weeks ago when she'd brushed off a stem into her hair after letting the gelding pass. She'd tried to shoo it off, quickly, not make his sacrifice a spectacle, yet it had stayed there all day. That day, I thought, someone like this, maybe I can stay. Tala closed her eyes for a second. "Yes," she whispered. The next morning, after early chores and brisk water choss on the porch, a preacher rode in from Missoula, an older man with steel-gray beard and soft eyes that still saw fragility in strength. Under the old cottonwood tree by the creek, they held a small ceremony. No grand congregation, just the preacher's voice carried by the wind, Tala's daughters tucking wildflowers into her braid, and Caleb's soft vow. "Tala Whitestar, will you stay?" the preacher asked, voice even and respectful. She held Caleb's hand tightly, feeling its rugged warmth. "Yes," she replied, "I stay." With that, Caleb took her free hand. "I choose you," he said, "and I labor for every tomorrow we have." No tears in her eyes, only quiet resolve. She raised it to the sky full of cottonwood leaves trembling in sunlit air. They shared strong coffee and simple bread in a woolen ring of blankets. The preacher blessed the little feast and then rode away. As night came, Tala walked back to the cabin holding Caleb's hand. She had never stood so firm, yet so peaceful. That night she lay beside him, hands clasped between them, and whispered, "You said I was good at staying." Caleb kissed her temple. "And you are," he said. "That's more than enough love." Their breaths synced. The world outside curled into darkness, but inside, a promise had taken root. The cottonwood leaves were still trembling long after the preacher rode off. That night, under the quiet hum of dusk and the soft clatter of dishes being stacked inside, Tala stepped out onto the porch with her shawl draped around her shoulders. The children had fallen asleep quickly, limbs tangled beneath the quilt she'd mended the week before. Caleb was already there, sitting on the top step, his carving knife resting beside him and a thin strip of pine in his hand. She didn't say a word, just eased down next to him, their shoulders brushing lightly. "I used to think," she murmured, "that staying was just another way to get caught. That the longer I stayed, the easier it would be for someone to find me, break me again." Her voice didn't waver, but it was low, nearly lost in the night wind. Caleb didn't speak at first. He just reached for her hand, fingers calloused like his, and held it steady in his lap. "You're not caught here," he said finally. "You're rooted." She turned her head slightly, watching the barn in silhouette, the slow shift of shadow as clouds passed the moon. "I don't know if I know how to be that." "You're already doing it," he replied. "You're not running." There was no big moment, no grand gesture, just the sound of frogs calling by the creek, and her head coming to rest on his shoulder, the soft press of her hand tightening in his. The next morning she was up before the sun. In the root cellar, her fingers brushed across the last of the winter potatoes, firm and sweet-smelling despite the season's change. When Caleb joined her, rifle slung across his shoulder, she turned and said simply, "I want a garden. Not just a corner row, something that feeds us. Flowers, too. Something that says this place is ours." He didn't ask why. He only nodded. "We'll clear more ground." And they did, with the children helping in their own way, Wayana collecting seed pods in a cotton satchel, Zoe trailing Caleb with a stick he called his measuring rod. They plotted out rows for beans, squash, cabbage, and lavender. The work was hard, the kind that left backs sore and palms blistered, but it was steady, and it was theirs. At dusk one evening, Tala sat back on her heels beside the first patch of sprouting leaves and looked toward the porch. "I don't know how to build a whole life," she said aloud, not knowing if he could hear her. But he had. Caleb stepped off the porch, crossed the field, and crouched beside her. "You don't have to build it all at once," he said. "We've already started." She looked at him then, long and deep, as if seeing the truth in him for the first time. "You're not afraid I'll break this?" "I'm not afraid of a damn thing with you beside me." That night, she didn't sleep in the guest room. For the first time, she lay beside him in the bed under the sloped roof of the cabin, the window open to the breeze and the scent of crushed sage drifting in. Her head rested against his shoulder, his arm around her waist, and she listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing until it pulled her into sleep. And when the rain came the next day, sudden and heavy across the pasture, she ran with him from the barn to the porch, skirts soaked and hair plastered to her neck. Inside, the children laughed and drew horses with wings on scraps of old paper. And Tala, standing near the fire with a dry towel in hand, looked at Caleb and whispered, This is the first time I've ever felt safe when it rained." He smiled and pulled her close. "You're not just safe," he said, "you're home." Their vows were spoken under cottonwoods, but the truest promise is what came next. If you believe in slow, steadfast love, tap like, subscribe, and ride with us to the very end. By early summer, the land around the homestead had softened, no longer braced against wind or snow, but open, generous. Beneath the wide Montana sky, rows of green pushed through the earth, beans winding up stakes, squash curling low to the soil, and lavender blooming in soft purples along the fence line. The scent of earth mixed with sun-warmed pine clung to their clothes by day's end. Tala knelt often in the garden, palms dirt-streaked and deliberate, whispering the names of each plant like old friends. Wayana sat nearby with a primer Caleb had traded from a passing teacher, carefully tracing letters with her finger in the dirt before copying them onto scrap paper. Zoe, never far from mischief or wonder, collected bits of twine and feathers to build nests for the birds he imagined would come if only he made a home good enough. They cooked together in the evenings, Tala slicing wild onions, Wayana stirring beans, Zoe pressing biscuits flat with both fists. Caleb watched from the doorframe sometimes, his hat still dusty, boots still muddy, a quiet pride settling into his bones. There was no need for declarations. The life they built was speaking for them. One afternoon, the sky cracked open without warning. Thunder rolled deep through the bitterroots, and the first drops fell fast, thick as knuckles on wood. Instead of fear, Tala laughed, a sharp, real laugh. She scooped Zoe up into her arms and ran for the porch, skirts flying. Caleb grabbed the basket of beans left out and followed, and Wayana dashed close behind, her spelling book held over her head like a flimsy umbrella. They reached the porch just as the rain turned to sheets. The children collapsed into a pile near the doorway, breathless and damp, and Tala leaned against the railing, water still dripping from her hair. She looked out at the sky, gray and weeping and alive. "It's been a long time," she said, voice soft but certain, "since I've felt rain without fearing lightning." Caleb stepped beside her, resting a hand gently on her lower back. He didn't need to say anything. She had named the feeling herself, safety not born of shelter, but of healing. Inside, Zoe was trying to dry his twine nests by the fire. Wayana had taken a pencil to the primer again, her lips moving silently as she sounded out a new word. Outside, the rain softened. And for the first time in many years, the storm meant nothing but water on growing things. The rain lasted through the night, steady as a prayer. By morning, the world outside shimmered, wet bark, clean air, the scent of sage rising from the hills like incense. In the yard, puddles gathered at the roots of the cottonwoods, and small prints led from the garden to the porch where Zoe had gone barefoot in the dawn. Later that day he found it, a single black feather caught between the boards of the fence. He plucked it carefully, turning it in his small hands, and held it up to the light. "Crow," he said with quiet certainty. "It was in Mama's dream last night." The crow was watching us. He tied the feather with a scrap of blue string and fixed it to the gatepost. Tala, watching from the porch, asked nothing. She simply placed a hand over her chest, where her heartbeat had begun to steady in ways it hadn't for years. When Caleb saw it later that afternoon, he paused. The feather stirred in the breeze, its shadow dancing on the wood. He remembered the stories his mother once read aloud from a battered family Bible. How the prophet Elijah was fed by ravens in the wilderness, messengers of God's quiet provision. He stepped closer, ran a calloused finger along the feather's quill, and murmured, "Maybe the Lord still sends crows." Inside the house, Wayana was reading Psalm 23 aloud from the primer, her voice halting but clear. Tala sat nearby, mending a worn hem. Her eyes lifted to Caleb through the open door, and something unspoken passed between them. Not doctrine, not certainty, but faith, reborn through the ordinary. A feather, a child's dream, a kindness without question. That evening, as the sun bled orange over the hills and the stove warmed the kitchen, Tala placed a new sprig of dried sage in the corner of the old Bible, just beneath the passage Wayana had read. She didn't say why. She didn't need to. The land was listening, and something greater was answering. By late autumn, the first apple tree bore fruit, small, red, imperfect, but sweet. Zoe ran in with one cupped in both hands, cheeks flushed with triumph. Tala took it gently, turned it in her palm, then kissed the crown of his head. They dried slices for winter, laid them in jars beside the beets and squash. Tala taught Wayana how to knead dough without overworking it, how to test the fire by scent and sound, not just by sight. Caleb mapped the garden with charcoal and butcher paper, each road drawn with a care that felt like prayer. The seasons slipped past like the turning of pages in a cherished book. The children grew, Wayana tall and sharp-eyed, stitching her own dresses with colored thread. Zoe quiet and strong, carving wooden birds and tiny wagons for younger neighbors. Caleb's beard turned white before he noticed. Tala's hands stiffened in the mornings, but her grip never loosened when she reached for his. They no longer spoke often of the past. It had faded into the soil beneath the lavender, into the smooth stones along the creek where the children once played. Every evening, after supper and prayers, they sat on the bench facing west. Sometimes Wayana joined them, bringing a song from the old tongue. Sometimes Zoe leaned against his father's side, listening to the crickets and asking about the stars. But often it was just the two of them. Tala's head would rest on Caleb's shoulder, her hand laced with his. The sunset poured over them in amber and gold. And neither waited for happiness anymore, because they had learned to live inside it, quietly, daily, with both feet on the earth and eyes lifted to heaven. They had come through the storm, and now, even in silence, they spoke of grace. If this story stirred something deep in you, a quiet ache, a forgotten hope, then stay a while. Western Love Stories is a series of timeless tales where love blooms in the dust, pain gives way to grace, and silence speaks louder than promises. Let your heart remember. Subscribe and saddle up. If you like this video, comment number 1. If you don't, comment number 2. Please subscribe to the channel to watch more videos and give me more motivation to collect and share other stories.